We're out of a cigar. I mean, you could count the seconds by the time that vapor that you see actually disappears and vanishes before your eyes. James is saying this is how our life is. And this coronavirus that has flipped our world upside down has brought to us in very tangible ways this truth. We're not in control. We're very small and insignificant. And all that we have planned for our lives can change in a 24-hour period. And so here we are. We need to face the reality that we are not in control of our lives. But when we realize that, and for those of us who have trusted in Christ, for those of us who are found in Him, that we understood one day that we were depraved and sinners, had no hope other than to cry out to God for forgiveness as we put our faith in Jesus Christ. For those of us who understand that our life is but a mist, it just appears for a little while, where do we find our hope? Where do we lay our rest? Well, secondly, we see in this text how the Christians should respond. Because secondly, we find that we should not fear because God is sovereign and in control of everything. While James tells us that we're not in control of our lives, he says, what is your life? You don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow. He does instruct us on how we should think rightly about God and about ourselves and how we should live our lives. Because look what he says in verse 15. Here's how we should respond. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. If the Lord wills, we will live. Our very breath is dependent upon God. If just for one moment we stop doing this, we will die. Our very breath, it depends on God. Our movements in life, the places we go and the things we accomplish or don't, all of it depends on God. And when we could say and think rightly about God and rightly in our hearts say, if the Lord wills, because we've understood the goodness of God, the faithfulness of God, then we who have trusted in Jesus Christ should live without fear of what may be happening around us, because we have understood that when we say, if the Lord wills, we're also saying that God is seated on His throne, that He is sovereign, and everything we experience and everything that happens runs through His sovereign care. So we don't need to fear anything. We should not be afraid. In the midst of the anxiety that we might be feeling, we need to be grounded and reminded that God is sovereign and He is good. We should not be afraid. Like the psalmist says in Psalm 112, 6-8, surely the righteous will never be shaken. They will be remembered forever. They will have no fear of bad news. Their hearts are steadfast, trusting in the Lord. Their hearts are secure. They will have no fear. In the end, they will look in triumph on their foes. When we finally understand, as we need to understand through this season, that anything and everything that could ever happen to us or around us happens only because our sovereign God has allowed it, He has willed it, then we could live without fear and face anything and face bad news. And so as we open up our phones and hear the latest update on your favorite news station, as you turn on your TV or scroll through Facebook and hear the latest rumors, and some of these can very easily bring anxiety to us, we should be reminded that we're not in control, but there's one who is in control. And He is sovereign, and He is good, And therefore we do not need to fear, but say, if the Lord wills. Because we know that God is working all things together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. So as bad as the news may seem, when we're hidden away in Christ, he becomes our strong tower. He becomes the solid rock on which we stand. And to be in Christ is ultimately to be safe and secure, where we could weather any storm. I'm reminded of 1 Peter chapter 1, where Peter reminds us that even though if for a little while we must suffer, let it be known that God is out working, refining your faith, transforming you into the likeness of his Son. Obviously, the context of 1 Peter is persecution, but we could apply it to this very moment. Even if we have to suffer, let us suffer well, knowing that God, our God, is seated on his throne, and therefore we do not need to fear. So listen, if we have been trusting in the economy, if we've been trusting in our military, if we've been trusting in our culture, in our strength, in our minds, in our abilities and talents, know this, they all come and go. They all have their beginning and will have their end. But our God is steadfast. Our God is always reigning, and everything filters through his hands. He is the one thing that we could count on. Because God has given us his Spirit, we Christians have a unique ability. Because of his Spirit that is inside those who have trusted in Jesus Christ, we have a refuge. We have a place of rest where the rest of the world does not have. In the midst of anxiety, the world that doesn't know Jesus has nowhere to go except in their own frailty and their own strength that leads them to no safe place, to no safe harbor. But we who have the Spirit of God, in the midst of the fear that we might experience in the flesh and the anxiety as things are rolling out in our midst, we know where to go. And we know where to go acknowledging that we don't have control, that we don't need to have control, because we have understood and believed and trusted in and rested in the one who does. So let us face the reality that we are not in control of our lives this morning. Let's let that settle in. And secondly, let us not fear, because God is sovereign and in control of everything. While we're not in control, he is. But lastly, here's the last idea. Let us take the opportunity to do good by loving, serving, and making the gospel known to all. This is how we are to live our lives in this moment. Because here's what the temptation is in our flesh, verse 16. As it is, you boast in your arrogance, all such boasting is evil. So the temptation is to want to control everything, that in our arrogance, we want to build something for ourselves and control it and gain. And in the arrogance, in the pride, we want to say, I have made it on my own. I am my own God. I control my own destiny. But James is pushing against that. And he says in verse 17, whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him is sin. So in this moment right now, as Christians, we need to see and consider what are the good things, the right things that we are to do, that in not doing them, we will be sinning against God. What are those things? Other translations say those good things. I'm reminded of Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, for we are God's handiwork, workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance beforehand so that we